Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Podcraft. This is the show all about podcasting, from launching your show to monetization and everything in between. I'm Colin Gray from thepodcasthost.com, joined by Matthew as always. How are you getting on, Matthew?
Yeah, fair to middling. I'm a bit dejected today. I've had these ongoing audio issues, and I'm testing microphones, and it's been I'm not going to get into the weeds on it, but it's getting me down a wee bit, I must say. But
drivers, whoever wants to play around with drivers in their life.
Yeah, I know. There's been wee ongoing issues that I've kind of should have properly addressed, I think, months ago, and putting sticky tape on it. And so anyway, I'll resolve to see what I could do about it in the coming week, I reckon. But how are you?
Sorted out. Yeah, fine. I have a funny little niggle that I've just realised I can actually fix really simply as well, which is, I think I've always had my microphone stand. So I've used like a boom arm for years, as you have as well. I think many people out there will. And I've always had it for some reason on my right-hand side. So the boom arm is attached to the right-hand side of my desk. And I've just realised that, like, whenever I'm recording, and I know this maybe isn't best practice, but we do it anyway because actually I want to kind of be comfortable and formal. So I sometimes drink a coffee while I'm recording. Mm-hmm. And I always drink that with my right hand because I'm right-handed. But I have to kind of play it around the mic, and sometimes I hit the mic because the mic's on the right. Why don't I just move it to the left? What an idiot. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I've always had it on the right just because that's my strong side, right-handed and all that. But I'm just going to move it to the left, and actually it's going to make things so much simpler. Even like reaching for my mouse and stuff like that too. It's just, dumb things you notice, eh?
I am relieved when you opened that with, I've got a funny little niggle that I reckon I could resolve quickly. I was thinking, fire me. That would solve a lot. But it looks like I've had a stay of execution. It was just a coffee anecdote.
Not today. So. That was another one. That was going to come next week, don't worry.
We'll do that live.
So what have we got this week, Matthew? What topic are we covering?
Yeah, we're talking about calls to action, CTAs, this week. And this is certainly, I reckon you could probably find data here, but this is very anecdotal to me, based on years of helping people to podcast and helping them to resolve issues. Ironically, just talking about issues I couldn't resolve myself. But a lot of podcasters that I've spoke to over the years, one of their biggest struggles is just getting the listeners to take action on whatever their calls to action are, whatever they're asking. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the end of the episode, which we'll get into, but this is a problem that I think a lot of podcasters, if they don't face it right now, they've certainly faced it in the past. So I thought this would be a good subject to tackle today.
Yeah, love it. It's always like whenever we've done the health checks in the past, podcast health checks, it's always the kind of, it's most commonly the big issue that a podcast has, isn't it? There's so many ways that you can do calls to action really well. There's so many ways that I think you can mess them up as well. So yeah, love digging into this. I think, and it is kind of one of the most easy ways to level up your show as well in terms of getting more out of it, isn't it? Whether that's just growing your audience or whether it's getting revenue out of it, whether it's promoting something. So yeah, let's dig into it.
All right then. To start things off, like we, as podcasters, like we build an audience around our content, whatever size that might be. We can't look past the fact that people are turning up every single week or every single episode to hear our thoughts, our message, our advice, and that's all for free. So I guess a starting point here is, like, podcasters, there's a range of reasons why you do calls to action and what your motivations there are, but a lot of podcasters tend to feel quite bad about this. Is that just me, or have you come across that speaking to folk as well?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, you feel bad for asking anything, doesn't it? We're creatives. We like making things. We don't necessarily like selling things. We don't like asking favors. I think as humans in general, like, it's something we're not particularly good at, isn't it? So why would that be any different on our podcast? Is that not you, Matthew? You like to just ask for stuff all the time on your show?
Yeah, I like the time I asked folk to buy cups, and I sold.
Yeah,
did I say one or two? I can't remember. One, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you could tell I'm really good and really well positioned to give advice on this. But
well, this is the trouble as well, though, isn't it? Because it's two sides of it. It's partly people are afraid to ask. because they think that people will hate them because they're asking a favor of some sort, whether it's anything from a review, like give me a review, right up to actually buying a product. The other part is you always feel uncomfortable asking those favors, like I mentioned. But then there's the fear, just like you're mentioning there. There's fear that when you ask for something, it'll be a failure. Like people won't actually give you the thing and you don't want to fail. So there's something around getting over the fear of failure, the kind of uncomfortability around asking for something for all of this time you're putting into the podcast. And yeah, let's get into all of that today. Like, I think we can get over that fear. We need to, as podcasters, if we're going to make our podcasts work, we have to be willing to ask for things in return to make it worthwhile for us too. It needs to go both ways, really, doesn't it?
So calls to action, or CTAs for short, what are some commonly heard CTAs in podcasting in your experience?
Do you reckon the most common one that you'll hear? This might be a really interesting analysis. Maybe this is something we should do, like get 100 transcripts from random shows and see what the most common ones are. But I would be willing to bet that rate and review my podcast is probably the most common one. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And this is a funny one, isn't it? Because there, as we've said before on the show, there aren't like loads of places to review the show, are there? Like there are a couple of big ones, if that. So I mean, ratings and reviews, obviously you could do ratings in slightly more places than you could do actual reviews. But yeah, that's throughout the history of podcasting. The review, classically the iTunes review, is the big call to action. What about some other ones?
Yeah, you've got feedback as well, get in touch, like that kind of stuff. I mean, that's the more useful one, I think. Like reviews are fine, maybe good to get a few in the bank in the early days to kind of give you some legitimacy. But later on, you're like more often than not wanting some feedback, get in touch, like send us something, some thoughts, like how can we improve the show? What do you enjoy about the show? What do you want us to cover in future? All that stuff's gold, isn't it? What about you, Matthew? What CTAs do you most commonly hear?
The Patreon one is very common these days, or a Patreon alternative, asking for financial support on an ongoing basis. You do hear that a lot. And to share the show as well, whether that's on social media, whether it's directly. Again, that's a call to action that makes a lot of sense, just that sort of growth orientation there. But I guess that leads us into like, what are the reasons behind these calls to action? People are asking for these things, but why are they actually asking for them?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is it, isn't it? Like, you should be asking because there's many good reasons to ask. I mean, it might just be as simple as covering the costs for the show. Like, you're providing all of this great content, this great entertainment, maybe even great education and helping people improve their lives. And yet you're spending money on hosting, on gear, on bits of software, on, all sorts of things, maybe even travel to go and do interviews, all sorts of things. So even if you just justify asking for like a Patreon subscription or purchase a mug, whatever it is, or whether it's, just donations via PayPal or whatever, even if it's just to cover your costs, that can be a huge thing. But then, the next level is that a lot of podcasters want to turn it into a business as well. They want to actually sell stuff and turn it into a living because you love making the podcast. It's valuable to people out in the world, and therefore, again, it's benefit both ways. If you can turn it into a business, earn a living through this whole thing, then actually you're able to give more great content to your audience and it benefits them too. So, creating a product, a service or something around it, or maybe it's an existing business, you're a plumber and you create a plumbing podcast to, promote that. So I don't know, there's all sorts of different reasons, like any others you can think of.
Yeah, like on that business, promoting a product or a service or a business, again, your business maybe predates the podcast, maybe not, maybe the business grew out of the podcast. But Colin, I just, I think it was yesterday or the day before, I listened to the Creator Toolbox, which is the show that you and Jacob do, and you had an interview with our mutual friend, Matty Lansdowne. Which was really enjoyable. So great. I like listening through to that, and I like the way that Matty talked about the fact that he's very clear on what he offers outside of the podcast, because he doesn't want the listener. He's creating a very good podcast, but he doesn't want the listener to think that that's where it begins and ends. Like, I'm doing a podcast, and that's it. He's got a very clear pathway of what he wants to happen. He knows not every listener is going to go through that and become a customer, but I think he does a good job at making that very clear on what he offers.
I think you're totally right. And I think there's something actually really nice about being super clear about that too. If you're creating a really good podcast, you're offering a lot of value, and people can sniff out when somebody's being a bit sneaky or hiding things or whatever. So if you're like running a podcast about, let's say, marketing, and then suddenly 10 episodes in, you only then admit that you run a marketing agency and start talking about your services, there can be a bit of backlash because suddenly it seems like you're just all doing this for sales. But if in the early days, you straight away, you say like, I'm going to give you a bunch of marketing tips. I learned some of it through the marketing agency I run, but also I just follow this and that, and I enjoy this other content. Like when you're really clear about the things that you do and why you have this expertise, I think it lends more trust. Like it doesn't sort of create that little conflict where people suddenly think you're going to start selling to them if you're just quite honest and open about it all in the first place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're open about the fact that we make Alitu and we would love for the listener to use it, but it doesn't mean that we pretend we're nothing to do with Alitu, and it doesn't mean that we won't talk about alternative options as well.
Yeah, totally. We mentioned the competition just as much, and even with our education and our content, yeah, totally. It's like, and I think it's a big part of it is establishing that expertise as well. The fact that we do all of those things and talk about them hopefully shows why it's worth trusting us in many ways as well. So yeah, I hope that comes across, certainly.
Just one more sort of deeper reason for calls to action. They might be more timely things like events or opportunities, surveys, competitions. So yeah, more sort of timely, this might be 3 or 4 episodes and then it's done sort of thing. But just looking at, I mean, that kind of leads in here to, we could kind of split calls to action into 3 categories, can't we? Starting with maybe the North Star goal, the ones that don't really change at all.
Yeah. So we've got the 3. We've got growing the podcast. So like you could have a call to action, which is like rating and reviews, potentially can grow the podcast, share it with your friends, blah, blah, blah. So growing the podcast is a big one. Growing the business is the other one. So whether it's an existing business, you're trying to get people to sign up for your products, your services, or whether it's a podcast business, selling merch, Patreon, whatever that might be. So that's a big one too. And then you've got, I suppose, actually the big one, the third one would actually be if it's a separate business. So you're a plumber, let's say, and you want to sell your plumbing services. So yeah, let's say growing the podcast business or growing a separate business. There's your 3.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, for us, like it will never change that, we always want to grow Podcraft, we always want to grow the site, we always want to grow Alitu. These aren't things that will change for us. So, these will always be calls to action, even if they're not specifically mentioned in every single episode. These won't change for us, will they? That's
a trouble as well, isn't it? As soon as you have, we have that trouble, that difficulty with a lot of the content we do is that we do quite a few different things. And so which call to action do we choose?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then going back to what we just talked about there, you've got second category of call to actions are your kind of time sensitive goals, aren't they?
Aye, yeah, like you said, events, maybe it's even giveaways, surveys, that kind of thing, that you just want somebody to do right away.
And then we've got the episode-specific stuff. So if we've, covered a particular topic, maybe that's not the end of the matter. Maybe we want feedback. We've got questions for the listener. Maybe we're offering a download or a resource or something. So that'll be the third category of call to action, the episode-specific one. And that ties into what you've just talked about in that episode.
Yeah, for sure. And they're kind of funny ones as well sometimes, aren't they? Because they're more built in, aren't they? So like just talking about like checking the description to download this thing, go to this link, whatever that might be. But they're just as important to think about, aren't they? And how you sort of hammer them home to make sure, again, and we're a bit of forward suggestion here, but one of the big problems with CTAs we'll talk about in a bit is actually having too many of them. So like as soon as you start building in a bunch of in-content ones, episode-specific ones, but combine them with the kind of larger ones for your business or your podcast, that's when it can start to get a bit tricky, isn't it?
Let's look at the positioning of your calls to action and their pros and cons. And for this, we can kind of learn from the typical podcast advertising positions, can't we? The pre-roll, the mid-roll, and the post-roll. So the pre-roll then, what are like the pros and cons of having your call to action right up front before the content even properly starts?
Yeah. Pre-rolls a good one because everyone hears it. It's right at the start of the show, so nobody's tuned out yet. So it tends to be a pretty valuable one. But the downside is you're asking for something before you've actually earned it, before you've given a lot of value in your episode. And equally, it's not necessarily given value itself. So anything you put in the first few minutes of your podcast that doesn't really draw people in, that doesn't give a ton of value, it's arguable it shouldn't be there, because really the job of the first few minutes of a show is to drag people in, to convince them that it's worth listening to the whole thing, to really engage them, give them a really positive experience and make them listen to the whole rest of the show. So yeah, pros and cons. They will hear it, but it can get in the way of the actual content itself and potentially put people off. What about the mid-roll, Matthew? That's always the second one, isn't it? Right in the middle of the episode. What are the sort of ups and downs of that?
Yeah, I mean, that is typically the spot that if this was an advert, like an advertiser would pay the most for the mid-roll, wouldn't they? Because it's bang in the middle of the episode or it's in the middle of the topic. This is the point where the listener is highly engaged. So again, if this is super relevant, it could work really well for you. But if, on the flip side, if it's not well done, if it's badly executed, it could be seen as a sort of interruption to the content as well, can't it? Especially if it is like a cut-in dynamic ad rather than you easing into that with a host-read call to action. So
yeah, totally. Like we've said already, it's all about context. I think, like tying it in some way. Like that's why it's so much worth doing host-read, like live host-read ads each time, I think, because you can tie it in a little bit to the content at least. So yeah, definitely. And I think just worth noting, I think the mid-roll is definitely, like you say, valuable because of the positioning. Like people are super engaged in the episode at that point, like halfway through. So a lot of people will hear it still. But it's also because you can make it longer. You can tend to make it longer. Like the pre-roll tends to be shorter. So if you're going to read a call to action at the start of your show, you tend to want to do that pretty quickly, so it doesn't get in the way too much, like we said. But the mid-roll, you can go a minute. You can go even to a couple of minutes, as long as it's like in context and valuable to the audience. So you can make a really big, like significant ask in that mid-roll. That's why it tends to be, for advertisers, like externally, it's really valuable. So that's why you should count it as super valuable for yourself as well, like if you're using it to grow your own show or your own business. What about the post-roll, Matthew?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the pros and cons of the post-roll, but we'd be remiss if we didn't have our own call to action in this episode, wouldn't we?
Nice. Okay.
So what could we ask for, dear listener? What could we ask for?
Good segue there. I like it. So in the spirit of this, I'll put it in context. And here's an example of a nice CTA. Right now, we're running a survey, so a Podcraft audience survey. So we'd love to hear from you. Like we mentioned earlier, it's a great call to action for anyone, and we are no different. So we'd love to hear what you like and dislike about this show, what you'd like us to do more of, what you would like us to do less of, what you'd like to hear more of in future as well. So if you go over and fill out the survey, you could win a $100 voucher as well. We're going to take one person, draw them out of a hat that fills out the survey, and send out a $100 voucher for that person too. So please do. We'd love to hear from you. This is really aimed at making this show better for you, getting your feedback. So go over to thepodcasthost.com/survey. That's thepodcasthost.com/survey. We'd love to hear from you.
All right then, the post-roll. So if we're going to put our call to action at the very end of the episode, is this when our most engaged listeners are still left, the folks that are more likely to take action anyway?
Yeah, that's the cool thing about the post-roll, isn't it? You're hoping that you've given like half an hour, 2 hours of value at this point, so everyone's really engaged. They're willing to pay you back a little bit. So if you ask them a little favor, then hopefully they're pretty positively, inclined towards it. So it could be a really good place to ask for, a review, survey, even a Patreon, all that kind of stuff. And also it's like at this point, you're not going to impact the episode, are you? Because the content's out of the way. So you're not going to get in the way at all, which is really cool. But I mean, what are the drop-off rates at this point, do you think? Like how often do you hear I don't know, I was about to say, how often do you hear adverts and just skip straight away? I do that a lot. But then again, when it's a host-read one, when it's actually in context of the episode again, I don't necessarily. What's your kind of feeling on the post-roll?
Yeah, I'm more likely to skip stuff at the start than the end, to be honest.
Really?
I'm more likely just to let the end run. And yeah, I mean, the end of the episode, it's the last word, isn't it? So again, going
Yeah,
back to what we
yeah.
were talking about, like, I think the listener, that they're most likely to remember at that point to go and do
Yeah.
what you're asking. So
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's really valuable. But I think given that value, I think that's why it's worth putting a fair bit of work into it and making sure it's recorded every time. You're not like repeating one that's the same every single episode. Like when it's the same thing every single episode at the end, that's when people just start skipping it and ignoring it completely. I don't know. There's a lot of interview shows these days that have like 5 minutes of ads at the end of them now, and I just don't listen to any of them. Like I just skip it straight away as soon as they come in now because it's the same every time. So yeah, I don't know. I don't see the value in those in that case, but I totally do if it's contextual. Yeah, for sure. If it's in the context of that episode.
before we skip on to some reasons that call to actions perform poorly and what we could do about them, what's your thoughts on how many? And I guess this will depend on episode length, but like as a pre-roll, mid-roll, and post-roll, is that acceptable? And should they all be the same call to action, or like what's your thoughts there?
My opinion, and it differs for every show. Tell me yours in a second. My opinion is that if you're going for the post-roll, mid-roll, pre-roll, post-roll, mid. I can't get the order right.
It's a lot of
How
rolls.
hard's that? Pre, mid, and post-roll approach. That should be the same call to action in every single one because you should be only really promoting one big external thing every episode, I would suggest. Because it's hard. It's hard to get people. Podcasting has a whole lot of strengths: engagement, attention, all of this stuff. But one of its downsides is that it is harder than average to get people to do something because they're so often out doing something themselves, like driving, walking, in the gym, whatever. So it's harder to get them to do something directly. And that's why I think it's just really worthwhile picking one thing, one call to action, and just pushing that. So a little suggestion of it in the pre-roll, a bigger kind of explanation of what you're asking and why it's worthwhile for them in the mid-roll, and in a post-roll, a kind of impassioned plea again, just to follow up on that and make sure you do that action that you're asking for. So that's what I think in terms of those external ones. But then again, in the content, I think then you can get away with asking like one or two more internal ones, if that makes sense. So like episode specific ones, like we said. So go and visit this link for this resource, or go and download this thing that'll help you out with it. And that's kind of separate from the larger podcast wide or business wide call to action. Does that make sense, Matthew?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. All right then, reasons that call to actions perform poorly and what to do about it. I guess a big one to start with here, Colin, is unclear, convoluted or vague calls to action. These are a big issue for taking action on, aren't they?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you need to make it as simple as possible. And I would suggest as well, like part of that clarity is making it really clear how people can take action on it as well. You're calling them to action, so help them do it by giving them a bit of a start. And one of the things we've talked about loads in the past, Matthew, isn't it, is to be specific about your ask. So don't just say at the end, I'd love to get your feedback. Tell me what you thought about this episode. Go to blah, 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 and do that. It's not really giving them much help, but that's kind of a total blank page problem, isn't it? So instead, what you want to do is say something like, all right, I'd love to hear what you think of this episode. We talked about microphones, like which microphone do you use and why do you use it? Like I suggested that earlier, it needs to be quite specific. Or maybe it's about growing your podcast, growing your audience. You're like, all right, so tell me, what did you think? Which one of these topics that I talked about, which one of these tactics that I mentioned are you going to use? And I'd love to hear how you're going to use it. And help them. You know, it's like giving somebody a page with prompts on it, as opposed to that blank page that just terrifies people. And it always sparks a little idea in people's heads when you're that specific. And that spark is what sends them or motivates them to go and open up the URL and actually take the action, as opposed to just, oh, tell me what you think, which is kind of useless. So yeah, so a big part of that clarity, like I say, is being quite specific, giving a bit of guidance, giving them a head start, and being really specific about where they go and do it. I mean, is it worth going into that, Matthew? That probably depends a bit on audience, doesn't it? Like where they should go and give the feedback, or where they should get in touch, or things like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean that kind of. So, like you're saying there, I definitely agree with what you've said there. And I think just to add that thinking about the ideal outcome, like we've talked about our call to action, the survey, the ideal outcome there is that people take the survey. And, then we could work back from that and think about, well, how can we best make people take the survey? And again, that ties into, sending them somewhere memorable. So we're sending them to thepodcasthost.com/survey. It's a very clear and easy URL to go to. We're using pretty links for that. So, like a lack of memorable links, a lack of URL, just not really being able to send them to any one place, that's going to affect your calls to action as well, isn't it?
Yeah. One of the best things I think a podcaster can invest in is a really good domain. Some kind of domain name for your show. Like we use the podcasthost.com because that's our main website link. I have used different ones in the past though, because I think even the podcasthost.com is a bit long. It's a bit kind of almost unmemorable. The fact it's got the on the start has always bugged me just a little bit, which is why I always tend to emphasize it. Tried to buy podcasthost.com at one point actually. But we've had, so podhost.me was a domain that I used for a while. So we had podhost.me/whatever you want as well. But more often than not, if you go and have a look, you can find something related to your podcast, whether even it's like bikepodcast.com or gympodcast.com or, the name of your podcast and podcast on the end potentially is nearly always available. So one of the best things you can invest in, I think. And then if you can set up something on that to perform those redirects, that can work really nicely.
We've kind of covered already, how many calls to action, but this is one of the reasons that calls to action fail, isn't it? Because there's just maybe too many of them. You've overwhelmed the listener, you've asked too many different things, and they just end up doing none of them ultimately. Yeah,
how many times have we seen in podcast health checks that the end of the show has 7 different asks in it? They'll go, right, thank you for listening to the show. I'd love to go and give me feedback on, go to Twitter and give me some feedback, like get in touch. And then I've got a survey over here. Go to blah.survey.com and then go and check out my Patreon. Make sure you subscribe to that. I've got a donations page over on PayPal over here as well.
Leave a review
and a rating. Go over here and listen to this other show that I do over here as well. And go and download this thing on the website here as well. Newsletters, blah, blah, blah. Every single time it's like 7 different asks. And it just means nobody does anything because you're overwhelmed with them. And they don't know which one to do. They don't know which one's most valuable, most useful. So pick one call to action and go with it at any particular time and swap it around. Like you can always do the other call to action you want on your next episode, but pick one per episode and stick with it. That's what I think always works best.
What about your favourite topic, Colin? Value propositions. How does that relate to calls to action and their success?
Yeah, I mean, value props for podcasts, very valuable, as we've talked about in the past, but it works for your call to action as well. I hope. Did I do this well on our survey one? Did I give a good value prop for the listener in that one, do you think?
There's always room for improvement, I suppose. In what way do you think you might have fallen short here?
Well, I think I did. The way I tried to do it with that one was to show why a survey is actually valuable to them. So there's 2 things, wasn't there? The $100 voucher is a big part of it. So that's one part of the value prop. You could win a voucher. But the other part, probably the more valuable one, was the fact that I think anytime you do a survey for your listener, it helps the podcast improve for them. So I tried to highlight that. So I tried to highlight that if they go and spend time filling it in, we'll spend time improving the show based on their feedback. They'll get control over it and it'll improve based on their feedback. So that's what we mean by a value prop, isn't it? It's like whatever the call to action is, why is it worthwhile for them? Why is it worth their time? Do you think, Matthew, you can get away with, I think, the most basic value prop being, if you've enjoyed this show, if you really enjoy the free content that I put out, you can really support me to create these in future by going and giving a rating and a review. It helps me to grow the show, which gives me motivation to create more great content in the future. Do you think that works? Like the whole if you've enjoyed this, I've already given you value. So here's one little thing you can do to support me. Is that worthwhile too?
Yeah, it's certainly worked on me in the past. If I've been listening to a podcaster, for quite a while, and I hear something like that, and I feel compelled to do whatever I could do, whether that's a small amount of money on Patreon or a review or just following up on what they're asking. So yeah, I do think, that kind of ties into that sort of emotional connection, doesn't it? And ultimately, that there is a deep-rooted selfish reason, because if you like a show, you want it to keep going, don't you? So the last thing you want is for the podcaster to feel like they're getting nowhere and just stop doing the show.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, I think that is the basic value prop you can use if you can't think of any other ones, but try and think of any other ways that you can convince them that this action is worthwhile to them. So, paying for something, a Patreon, for example, the value prop, you actually have to sell why the Patreon's worthwhile. So maybe it's premium content. You're going to tell them all of the extra things they'll get, extra episodes, behind the scenes, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it's like they get to ask you questions and get featured on the show. You need to sell it. The benefits to them. It's all about the benefits, not the features. Like, how does this benefit them when you're given this call to action? So yeah, it's signing up for a newsletter. What do they get for that? What's it going to help them with? What problems are going to solve in their life? That's often a good way to think about value propositions, is what problem will you help them solve through this? So with our survey, we're going to solve the problem that podcast is just utterly boring and useless for them, hopefully, by hearing what they want us to do better.
That ties into Fire and Me, I guess. But I know, thinking about that value proposition, like even something like asking for a review, like you could do something like, well, leave a review, take a screenshot, email me it, and I'll give you this ebook, or I'll give you this access to my premium community. There's always wee sort of transactional trade-offs here you could do, isn't there? Just to increase the chances of folk actually doing it. So
yeah, totally. Love it. The other one that we had noted down here was emotional connection, isn't it? It totally ties into this. Like, how do you make a call to action more emotionally connected to the listener? Like, how do you think about that?
That really is what we've been talking about, isn't it? Like one of the kind of emotional connections that you'll make is that plea to help make the podcast better. Was there something else on that front that you kind of had in mind?
No, just curious whether you had anything to add to that. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of, you're hoping you've made an emotional connection through the podcast itself because you're sharing about yourself. A lot of podcasters actually I've seen use more, like they share a bit about their life and their call to action. So the Patreon, maybe it's like, this is actually helping me to, cut my hours in my job that is a dream of mine, to then spend more time in the podcast to offer more value to you. And it's like, it's actually showing the effect that these have on you as a podcaster, isn't it? That I think can make that connection and really make it even more effective.
What about a final reason that it's literally only mentioned once and the podcaster's kind of hoping that that'll be enough, but that's not really the way it works, is it?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's why we've got the pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll. Oh, look, I got it right. Formatting, isn't it? Because it's like 3 points through the show. But there's also the idea of mentioning it multiple episodes as well, isn't there? Like how many, if you had a campaign, for example, or a survey, like how many episodes minimum do you think you should run it before it becomes effective?
When I made the notes here, I've said at least 3, but I'm tempted to say more. What do you think?
I think we've always thought 3 is a kind of good minimum, isn't it? We've talked about that a few times. Like I think if you've got a campaign you're running, I think 3 episodes is a kind of minimum viable. That's what gets it into people's heads. But I think you're absolutely right. Like I'd be tempted to say like 4, 6 episodes, like a month and a half even. If it's something that's really important to you, if it's something that has a big effect on the show, mention it. Yeah, keep going. Like a month and a half, probably good effect. And maybe it's the kind of thing that you can A/B test quite easily as well, as in you can test different lengths and see how much effect that has. Like a survey, for example. In fact, let's commit to do this, Matthew. We can see with a survey, like when we first mentioned it on Podcraft, and we can mention it every week for the next month and a half, 2 months even, and we can start to see when the peak of responses come in. I can graph like when responses come in, so we could start to see an effect of this. So yeah, I'll dig into that data in a couple of months once we've finished this survey, and we might be able to give some good feedback on this.
That's been a fun conversation, Colin. I hope the listeners found it useful as well, and no pressure now that we get to the the post-roll call to action. So, and we do actually, I've written down here, we've got a couple of places to send them, so completely disregarding all our own advice. But I mean, one of them literally is just a link to the full guide. Like if you want to go in depth on this in the written word, Lindsay's got a very good guide. It's thepodcasthost.com/CTAs. Looks very like /cats. But it's CTAs. So the cats link, that takes you to a different website entirely.
Yeah, we need to do that as well now, though. We need to actually write cats as a short link to make sure it goes to the same place. That's that funny phenomenon where if you take a word and you take the first and the last letter and keep them the same but mix up all the rest, people can still read them for some reason.
Yeah, aye. It's like your brain saving energy, isn't it? So.
Yeah, totally. Right, no, but I'll say, I think we're still going by our rules here because we've got one internal one call to action, which is like internal to this podcast, as is it's strongly related to this episode. So go and get our full guide on CTAs, like Matthew said, thepodcasthost.com/CTAs. But our bigger, grander call to action that we're going to run for the next 6 weeks or so is the survey. So again, I'll make this impassioned plea, and you've seen inside the sausage now, so you'll know exactly why I'm saying all this. Helps us to help you. Do I need to repeat it again because of that? It helps us to make the podcast better, genuinely. Like this, surveys like this do actually work that way. Like we'll read this, we'll hopefully get loads of your opinions, we'll see what you like, what you don't like, what you want us to do more of, what topics you want us to cover. So it'll help us make the show better for you. Plus, hopefully you get a chance to win $100 in voucher form. So go over to thepodcasthost.com/survey. That's thepodcasthost.com/survey. All right. Marks out of 10 on that one then, Matthew. Is that one right?
I thought you did well, Colin. I'll go for the emotional one. It'll make me feel a lot better seeing a response to this because I'm still piddling away with these audio drivers and microphones and trying to get them. And then my daughter this morning literally told me that she wished she had a better daddy. So, yeah, I'm in a good place today. Yeah, we were getting ready. I take her to nursery on a Wednesday and she was moaning at me and stuff and she just came out with it. Yeah, I wish I had a better daddy. I was like, oh, thank you, Brooke.
Did you manage to hold back the natural response, which is, I wish I had a better child?
I never said that, but I should have. I should have laid that down. But no, I just put the bottom lip out. So
that is the core skill in parenting, I think, is to not actually give the standard response you'd give to, like, you know, the annoying colleague at work or that friend that you kind of always get pissed off at. And you would obviously give them a good put down in return, probably, but the main skill in parenting is not applying that to your child generally.
Yeah, it's like trying to understand that she's 3 and not very tactful at the moment, but also maybe she genuinely believes that, and that's not great. But I guess I'll get over it.
She doesn't believe it. All right, there we go. Yeah, so make Matthew feel better. Fix Matthew's heart by filling in our survey. Again. Because like answers on a type form definitely counter the fact that your own child hates you. Yeah. We'll know this works. This post roll has worked. If someone, please do this. If someone fills out the survey and mentions the fact that they want to heal your heart from the horrible comment that your child gave you, Matthew. Good stuff. All right. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks for following along. We always appreciate you guys out there, guys and gals, following along with Podcraft. Hope we're helping with your podcasting journey. We'll see you on the next one. We'll talk to you then. Cheers.